So this brutality against people is having a serious, traumatic effect on people in the community. But there's also, in addition to those mental health effects, right, we see this increase in depressive symptoms, which, doesn't necessarily mean depression. We're not talking necessarily about a diagnosed mental illness. We're talking about the effects of trauma. This is trauma that people are experiencing, and this can increase those, those symptoms of depression. But also, really importantly, the psychological impacts. So when we see the messaging around, the message of Black Lives Matter is in direct response to this belief, right, that when you're, I'm going to be blunt, when you're literally killing Black people in the street, that gives the impression that those lives don't matter. Right. And so this is in direct response to that. And it is important because, unfortunately, that psychological impact, particularly on young Black boys, is significant, that they don't see that their lives matter. They don't see that they are important. They don't see that they are valued, that they have a negative view of their future, a negative hope for their future. Like, this is what they have to look forward to. And this is, and I don't want to give the impression that this is just for boys, right? This is for girls too. We're still, don't have justice for Breonna Taylor either. So this affects both genders, all ages, but significantly the young people, the kids, the perception that they have for their future, and that this is what they have to look forward to. It causes a significant psychological impact. And that, unfortunately, can increase that risk for suicide for Black kids.
And I haven't double checked the stats, but I know for a while that whole right, the hypothesis was that the combination of community violence and police violence and all of those things were increasing some of those depressive symptoms. And so that younger and younger African-American boys were one of the fastest growing demographics of people, although still in small number in terms of rate of growth, were one of the fastest growing rates of people impacted by suicide. And I think, right, because of those combinations of factors. And so again, I don't know what recent data, but I know a few years ago, people were really kind of curious and concerned about it. I don't ever remember us having a system-wide response or even a larger conversation about it. Mm-hmm. But I know the data was there.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're referring to the CDC data on suicide in Black children. And there has been while again, it is small numbers because suicide is rare, especially for younger children. The suicide rate for young Black children has doubled in recent years, whereas the suicide rate for white children has decreased by half. Which, once again, plays back into our responses not being culturally relevant, because, in that regard, there is some effect on reducing suicide for young white children, but for young Black children, the rate has doubled. This was something that was extremely troubling. I have not seen, we don't know why, right? We don't know why this is happening. It did catch the attention of some of our Black political leaders. There was the Congressional Black Congress, did kind of an investigation, but yes, the suspicion is that it is due, right, to these increases in, violence and racism that people are experiencing, and the effects of the media attention that is being put on these things. So understanding that the more that yes, it's good that we have the videos, and we need those, to prove the things that are happening, but the constant circulation of those videos is very detrimental to children to witness that consistently. So yeah, we don't have really good answers on why this is happening. And we need more attention on this. We need definitely a lot more attention trying to figure out what is happening to Black children that is leading to this very dramatic increase in the suicide rate.
And I know we won't have time to talk about it here, so people need to attend Kim's training. But the other thing that, you make sure that you talk about is undercounting in numbers, underrepresentation, it not necessarily, so we really don't even have a real sense of the numbers, because maybe some of the incidents that look like community violence or unfair gunplay or all of those things could be misdiagnosed or mischaracterized, so we're not even really aware of the depth and breadth of the impact, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about, racism in our systems, right, this permeates suicide prevention as well. The field of suicide prevention itself is built on knowledge and understanding of suicide in white people. So we don't, the way that we define things, the way that we study things, all of our research and our data is on suicide in white people. Our information on the effectiveness of our programs is on white people. So we don't really have good information. So this is something, there is becoming more of a call to action that we need to better understand this. But understanding our statistics on suicide come from coroners and medical examiners' reports of deaths. And that again is a system that has racial bias embedded in that system. There is a, belief about what constitutes suicide. We have definitions of suicide, and there's a lack of understanding that other communities can engage in this in other ways that don't necessarily fit the definition that we have extracted from our information on white people. And so what we do understand is that in communities in cultural groups where there is a lot of negative beliefs about suicide or strong cultural norms against suicide, people don't necessarily engage in suicidal behaviors the way that we typically define those. So it's not always direct action against the self and the body. So usually when we think of a suicide, we're thinking of somebody who takes that very deliberate injury action to injure themselves, in an attempt to end their life. Well, what we're starting to understand is that for, people in the Black community where there is a strong norm against suicide, this belief, unfortunately, there's a strong belief that Black people don't die of suicide, which is untrue. It's not true at all. But they may not engage in those behaviors in the same way, right? So sometimes and it's something that strikes me all the time when I hear this with community violence and people who are engaging in community violence, young kids who are engaging in community violence. And when we hear them talk about not having any hope for their future, right? That they don't care if they die, right? To me, as a suicidologist, I'm going, these sound like suicidal statements, right? But we understand that the norms in the community may bring a lot of shame against somebody who ends their life in the typical way that we do. So engaging in behaviors that bring somebody else to end your life can also be suicidal. It's actually something we call indirect suicide. It's not as well recognized. And unfortunately, when that happens, we're more likely to classify those deaths as homicide deaths because somebody else, brought that death upon the person, even though the person may have been inciting, right, for that harm to come to them. And so it's really undercounted. We don't necessarily define it in the same way. We don't look at it in the same way. And this is part of the reason our interventions are really, may not be very effective because we're talking about preventing suicide preventing behaviors, suicidal behaviors that white people engage in, not preventing potentially suicidal behaviors that Black people may be engaging in.
So clearly we could have this conversation for a while, and I'm also
Yes.
aware of the time. So I'm gonna do something because I'm also imagining, because we were talking about the racial dynamics, but when I also, having lived in Champaign, I'm always acutely aware of what happens in the farming community. And I'm wondering if some of these missed cues, missed reflections also get reflected, because so much of a culture, right, when you think about the coroner's office and culture and family, I just have heard so much about the rates of both addictions and depression in the farming community because of all the stressors. Is there been any discussion about that, too, in this conversation right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there is a higher rate of suicide in farmers. And COVID as well is having an impact on that. We've seen in the news and heard about farmers not having markets for their crops, not being able to sell their crops or their animal agricultural products, and so there's a lot of stress, and there was a lot of stress on farmers pre-COVID as well. This is something that has been happening for quite a while. But yes, again, that is a community where there is a strong negative perception about suicide. And so this is something that also impacts our rural communities in general. There's a lot of fear about other people knowing what you're going through. And so it's something that for rural communities, this becomes more of a problem when you're in those communities where everybody knows everybody, right? And everybody knows what's going on in everyone's life. So when, you may be going to a mental health service provider, right, to try to receive services, there's a fear that, but somebody's going to see my car there. They're going to know that I'm there. They're going to know that I have a problem. So that fear of the stigmatization, right? Fear of other people knowing what's going on with you, that stigma that people feel around suicide is very strong in rural communities, and in particular farming communities. There's this kind of culture around farming that, they're tough people, right? The salt of the earth. And so when we have these perceptions of suicide as being this weakness, this mental emotional weakness, people can have a very difficult time in talking about their experiences, looking for services and supports around those experiences.
Wow. So let's make that maybe the segue, because this is right. We could continue to talk about this, and I'm hoping the audience is super curious and will follow up and stay engaged with you. But you were hinting at that. So what is it that you, right, like if you've got a whopping 20 minutes to talk about, like, what is it that you feel like people need to hear? So like if you were going to leave some helpful strategies, and I don't know if it would be easier for you to think about, like, if you had a family member or a friend or a partner who was, what should they look for? What would be, and what would you say, right? Like how, maybe some tips and strategies. I know not enough, but like get us into the door.
Sure. So I think that probably one of the things to start with is this understanding why people have thoughts of suicide, right? What happens? Why does this happen? How do people get to this point? And so I think it's a really big myth. It's a common misperception that if you have thoughts of suicide, that means you have a mental illness, right? It means you have, typically people think depression, but there's this belief that suicide is an outcome of mental illness. So if you have thoughts of suicide, that must mean that you're mentally ill. And that's not the case at all. Suicide it's a response to distress, right? To stress that people are feeling in their lives, to you know, when people have a crisis, when they experience trauma, when they are emotionally overwhelmed and don't have the capability of coping with what they're experiencing in their life, that's when people can, you know, develop thoughts of suicide. So when we look at the risk factors of COVID, right? COVID did not all of a sudden make everybody mentally ill, right? It didn't increase mental illness. What it did was it increased distress that people were experiencing. So that's the first thing, is we have to, you know, kind of get past this equation of mental illness and suicide and understand that suicide is in some ways just a response to distress in our lives. And so one of, you know, a few tips for people, first of all, is we have to talk about it, right? But people don't understand. They don't know how to talk about it. They don't know what to say. And I guess, first of all, we should talk about warning signs. So
that's helpful.
Yeah, let's talk about, how do you know, right? How do you know that somebody, or, you know, what are the signs that somebody may be having thoughts of suicide? Now, usually we talk about things, you know, things that would show that the person is in distress, right? So any of those big behavioral changes in mood, changes in sleep patterns, all of those things. There's a long list of stuff. The problem is we're not really good at recognizing those things, right? We don't always recognize them in each other. We tend to attribute them to other things. So I always try to stress to people, pay attention to what other people say. Right. So when they're saying things that indicate these things, when they're saying things like, my life is over, right? Nothing matters anymore. Saying that they feel worthless, that other people would be better off without them, right? They're a burden on people. Those types of phrases indicate that this person is really in crisis and is potentially having thoughts of suicide. So one of the things that we can do is when we recognize those phrases, try to talk to the person about it. And so in our training, we kind of go through a method. I'll give an example here really quickly, but ways that you can open the door and help them to feel comfortable talking about it. So if this was somebody that I knew who had made a comment to that effect, just saying, this is just too much. I'm just done with it. I'm just done with it all, right? I might say something like, sometimes when people feel really stressed and overwhelmed, they may not see ways that things can get better. When you say that you're done with it all, do you mean that you're thinking about suicide? Right? Yeah. So we just want to pay attention to this thing that they said and just ask them, do you mean suicide? Is that what you're talking about? Right? So that's one way. If we've noticed this thing that somebody has said, we can kind of ask them that question and start the conversation. But it's also really good if we take the initiative to have these conversations rather than waiting for people to show signs. So we can also use this to kind of start the conversation in general. For example, saying something like, it's really stressful when everything is so uncertain right now. And with all that's happening, it's understandable that you may be overwhelmed. Yeah. Others have said that sometimes when they feel this way, they have thoughts of suicide. Is this something you have thought about? So we can just initiate the conversation in general and just bring it up to start talking about it.
I'm going to ask you the question, that everybody asks in a suicide awareness training. You mean if I ask the question, I'm sorry, need to get the sarcasm, right? But many people have a legitimate fear that if they bring it up, they're planting a seed. Can you speak to that?
Yes, that and that is, it is a fear that I hear a lot, and it's a myth. So people who are not suicidal or not having thoughts of suicide, they're not going to start thinking about it because you ask them. Right. So it's not as if people are kind of going, well, gee, I have this really big problem, all of this stress, I don't know what to do. And I was thinking about doing this, but now that you mentioned suicide, that seems like a good idea. It doesn't work that way, right?
I'm not laughing at folks, but I do, right? Like a lot of people feel like if you talk, right, if you bring it up, then you somehow planted a seed.
Absolutely. And I understand that's a very big fear for people. And I think people are also really fearful of asking the question because we're really afraid of what if this person says yes. And then I don't know what to say and I don't know what to do and I don't know how to help them. And then if you know they told me that they were suicidal and then they do die or they attempt suicide, then somehow it's my fault. And so we kind of get this idea that maybe it's just better if I don't know, right? And so there's a lot of those fears, and those are some of the things that we hope to address in our training to help people feel more comfortable talking about this, address those fears, that you're not giving people the idea, if they weren't already thinking about it, they're not going to think of it now that you ask them. But really what you're doing is if they are thinking about it, you're making it safe for them to talk about. You're opening that door and giving them that safe place where they can talk about their experiences. And what we do know about suicide is talking about it, talking about the feelings, the experiences, what people are going through. That's what's really effective in helping to prevent suicide attempts.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's the bottle about to burst. It's sort of the letting
Exactly.
the air off of the Coke bottle, just because sometimes the more we stuff, the more we hold. And so providing opportunities for people to leak a bit.
Exactly, exactly. The more chances that we give them to talk about those things, the less likely they are to, to burst.
Yeah, yeah. So, other tips and strategies that, like we've got 10 minutes to go. Are there other tips and strategies that you feel like, in terms of leave behinds, that we should talk about?
Right. So there's a couple things that I really want to make sure that we cover. So talking about safety planning and mean safety.
Okay.
So mean safety is talking about preventing people from the access to means that they can use to end their life. So things like firearms, medications are the two primary ones that we talk about. And so thinking about, if you have somebody that in your life that you maybe have concern about, if you have somebody that seems to be going through a difficult time, seems to be experiencing some crisis or trauma, or has told you that they have thoughts of suicide, taking steps ahead of time to secure firearms, lock those up, to get medications that you don't need out of your home, to lock up other medications in your home is really effective. We know that mean safety does save lives, because very often, like you just talked about, suicide attempts can occur in times of crisis when it's just too much, right? When they're just so overwhelmed. So if we can prevent access to the means, we give time for that crisis to resolve, right? Emotionally, they can start to feel better, and that desire, that urge for suicide can lessen. So mean safety is really important. Mean safety is also something that we do in safety planning. And so there is an app on your that you can download on your phone. It's called the My3 app. It's just MY the number 3 APP, and they have a website, my3app.com. And this is an app that you can use to create a safety plan for someone. And what a safety plan is it's essentially like we come up with plans on what we're going to do in other times of crisis, like, right? So we have plans for tornadoes and we have plans for fires. We can have a plan for what to do for an emotional crisis as well. And so it's just kind of a list of steps that people can go through, that if I'm in crisis, and if I am, experiencing that emotional crisis and having thoughts of suicide, what are the things that I can do to help alleviate that crisis for myself, to help kind of bring that down and help me manage my feelings. And so the safety plan app will kind of walk you through things. It goes from, general coping skills to hotlines and professional help. So there's a lot of good strategies there that people can use on their own to manage their feelings, so that they do have control. Just because they have these thoughts or they have these feelings doesn't mean that they can't control it, right? Doesn't mean that they have to act on them. And this is a really good way to help manage crisis.
So, thanks for sharing that. And I'm going to do a little thing because I can imagine there's a parent out there that's like, we're going to do the app and then we're going to micromanage it. And so know that control is a trigger for most of us. So let your folks, talk about it, but don't go be an invasive where they don't have any privacy or space, because that's just an added stressor.
Yeah, absolutely. So a safety plan should be done for the person who's using the plan. So, the family and friends and supportive people, you're there for support, right? You're not there controlling the plan. But, of course, if you want more information on safety planning, you can attend one of our trainings. We talk about it in a lot more detail, and helping people learn how to do a plan and all of the aspects that go into that. But again, this is a really effective tool that people can use for themselves.
Wonderful. And I know that there'll be information when we went at the broadcast, when it's aired on UPTV, it'll be there, or people can go back to the YouTube list, but on the broadcast, it'll be your tips and strategies will be included. So you mentioned that there was one more thing. So you talked about safety planning, and what was that last thing? I don't want to lose it.
Mean safety.
Yeah, so you talked about means safety planning,
Yeah.
and safety.
And I want to make sure to talk about crisis lines.
Yes, okay, please do.
Yeah. So we do want to make sure, we always want to make sure that people have access to crisis lines. So these are really beneficial. So if you don't feel that you have people in your life that you can trust to talk to about these things, or that will be supportive of you, you can call crisis lines. You can also, if you are that parent, right, with a child, or you're that family member and you're like, I really don't know what to do to help this person that I love, you can call a crisis line and they can give you tips and help you through that situation. So a couple of them I want to make sure to mention. First of all, related to COVID, because that's a big stress right now, the Disaster Distress Helpline. And that phone number is 1-800-985-5990. They also have a text line. It's available in Spanish, and they have translators for other languages. But the Disaster Distress Helpline has crisis counselors that are specifically trained to help in times of trauma and disasters. So natural disasters, man-made disasters, but also pandemics, right? So if you have stress about COVID, you can call the Disaster Distress Helpline. The second one I want to mention is called Blackline. The phone number is 1-800-604-5841. And this is a hotline that is specifically set up for Black people to discuss stress and issues around police violence. So it's kind of specifically for that issue. So if that is something that you're struggling with or that you're dealing with in your life, you can call them and get support. And then in general, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255, and the Crisis Text Line. So you can text to 741-741, and those are for general crisis support.
And I know I'm running out of time. We have 3 minutes, but I also, so if you are a family member or a loved one or a friend, because I have seen on Facebook a number of people who are have been impacted by suicide, where should they go? Where could those folks who need support, or are you aware of resources locally, or is that an underdeveloped need? Resource, right? Like, is there a gap in the service array for survivors?
Absolutely. So this is very much an underdeveloped need. There are gaps there. So we do have a local support group for survivors of suicide loss. So if you have lost somebody and you're dealing with that grief, unfortunately, we don't have support groups for people who are living through it. It's definitely something that is needed, not just in our community, but in many communities. There's definitely a shortfall. But the one thing I do want to stress is all of these crisis lines that I just mentioned, you can use them as well. So if you are, the supportive person, or you have this person in your family that is dealing with suicide, you can, and you need help for yourself, right? And you're going, this is overwhelming, this is scary for me, I don't know what to say to this person, I don't know what to do. This can be very painful for the people who love them, to see your loved one going through this, and being so unsure about how to help them, right? Not knowing what to do. You can call the hotlines too. And they can give you some guidance and give you some support on how you can be a support to that person, and also managing your own feelings about that, right? Because we have a lot of concern for the person who is experiencing thoughts of suicide, but this can be very emotional for the people who are supporting them. And so you may need some support around your own feelings with, your loved one. And so you can reach out to the hotlines as well.
And I know we're completely out of time, and so Jason's going to kill me, but Emma, I would be remiss if I didn't say out loud, and I know it's included in your resources, that we did not talk about the needs of gay, lesbian, transgender, transsexual, the whole spectrum of sexual diversity and sexual identity. And I know that there are unique vulnerabilities, and I guess I want to make sure that I didn't want to end this conversation without uplifting and elevating, not necessarily, right? So in the list of resources that you're going to share, there are also crisis lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people want to go to our website at rattlethestars.org/resources, we have a whole host of crisis lines and other resources that are available for many different populations, including specifically for LGBTQ people as well.
Kim, it has been wonderful. Thank you so much for spending the hour and sharing your brilliance, your wisdom. Thank you for all of the work that you do, and thank you for rattling the stars.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Stay well.